I'm Dr. Roy Barsness, author of the text Core Competencies in Relational Psychoanalysis, a guide to practice, study, and research, and founder and executive director of the Contemporary Psychodynamic Institute, who is the sponsor of these interviews. In the first episode of these series, I spoke of the research behind the compilation of the text that resulted in the discovery of 7 core competencies reflective in the practices of relational psychoanalysis. Those competencies, or what I would prefer to call disciplines, are therapeutic intent, number 2, therapeutic stance, number 3, deep listening, affective attunement, number 4, the there and then and the here and now, number 5, patterning and linking, number 6, repetition and working through, and number 7, courageous speech, discipline, spontaneity. A separate and overarching core competency was that of love. I then recruited various relational psychoanalytic writers to write about each of these disciplines, and I've now interviewed them for this series. So welcome to today's episode featuring myself and my co-author, Bradley Strawn. And we will be speaking on our chapter, competency number 7, courageous speech, discipline, spontaneity. Dr. Strawn and I are very good friends and have co-authored and co-presented many times together. And he is the Evelyn and Frank Fried Chief of Spiritual Formation, Integration, and Professor of Clinical Psychology at the Fuller Graduate School of Psychology. He holds degrees in both theology and psychology and has advanced training in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. He is the co-editor of Spiritual Diversity and Psychotherapy, Encountering the Sacred, Christianity and Psychoanalysis, A New Conversation with Earl Bland, and co-editor of a volume of Psychoanalytic Inquiry with Marie Hoffman on psychoanalysis and religion. He is a consulting editor of the Journal of Psychology and Christianity and associate editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology. In addition to being a professor, he is a licensed psychologist, prolific writer, and maintains a private practice in Pasadena, California. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Roy. Always good to be with you.
I know it is, isn't it? So in the research and in my introduction to this chapter, I begin with a quote from Martin Buber, who says, "To keep nothing back is the exact opposite of unreserved speech. True, authentic dialogue is fulfilled in its being between partners who have turned to one another in truth, who express themselves without reserve, and are free of the desire for semblance. There's brought then into being a memorable common fruitfulness, which is to be found nowhere else." The relational analyst holds to the notion that a patient needs to hear what is on the therapist's mind and how the therapist experiences them. Analysts take risk by stating what has come to their mind within the context of the therapeutic relationship. Risky though their speech may be, analysts offer their ideas from a non-authoritarian stance with tentativeness, curiosity, and humility. Words are offered to the patient with the spirit of inquiry, exploration, and negotiation. Analysts consider their thoughts and affects and attempt to metabolize before they speak and while they are speaking. And they're also willing to make a mistake in speaking, given their predisposition to follow the patient's response as a means for discovering understanding and meaning, rather than through analytic interpretation. Interventions, thoughts, words come as conversations. When to speak and what to say remains challenging, but it is evident that the relational analyst chooses to let the patient in on their thoughts, believing that in doing so, the work is advanced. What was striking to me in my research around the practice of courageous speech was the act of humility that was evident in the delivery of the analysts. Participants made statements such as, "Psychoanalysis is a discipline of restraining oneself with being courageous enough to speak to what has happened. It is about showing our emotions without being self-referential and maintaining the focus on the patient-therapist relationship. It is about wondering why I might wish to say something and why I might wish to not say something." The analyst stated that there is a caution to be mindful of the compulsion to interpret when we feel clever and to see this work as a mutual endeavor. In this chapter, my colleague Brad Strawn and I take a look at this particular competency through the lens of acknowledging erotic arousal within the therapeutic relationship. I want to briefly share with you the properties that came out of the research. And these are essentially direct quotes from the participants who were interviewed. So let me go over them with you. Number one, the analyst holds to the notion that the patient needs to hear what is on the therapist's mind and how the therapist experiences them. They say out loud what they're thinking about and what they are experiencing. They adhere to the ethic of honesty, both within the patient and within themselves. They resist the urge for self-protection. Number five, the patient knows at some level the mind of the therapist, and thus it needs to be spoken. Clarity emerges from honest speech. Time of speaking is adhered by tending to what is happening in the moment and in between the patient and the therapist. General principle is to disclose and then follow the patient's and the analyst-patient relationship's response. We must regulate our own shame as it limits full involvement. The analyst offers her ideas from a non-authoritarian stance with tentativeness, curiosity, and humility, attending to how one's interventions, words expand, clarify, and deepen the patient's experience. It's an odd combination of restraint with being courageous. Show emotions without being self-referential and maintaining the focus on the patient. Considering their own motivations for action and how this is relevant. Formulates thought and affect dialogically and is open to the negotiation of ideas and affects. The goal in speaking boldly is to provide an authentic interaction. Careful not to fill up space with their own needs or cleverness, but to keep the space open towards an understanding of the patient through our experience of them. Interpretation is only helpful to understand and consolidate what has happened experientially and work the transference rather than interpret it. Brad, thank you so much for joining me today. And we begin our chapter by saying that all therapy is disclosure. What do you think we're trying to communicate with that rather bold statement, I would say?
Yeah, I think we started with this opening sentence that from a relational psychoanalytic paradigm, all therapy is disclosure, and acknowledgement of what is actually presenting itself in the therapeutic encounter, most notably affective experience and conflicts, requires considerable courage and discipline, but is in fact necessary for a successful therapy. The moment a client talks to us on the phone or walks in our office or sees us on Zoom or in person, we're telling them all sorts of things about who we are. And yet we kind of fool ourselves or pretend as if we're not. And so the question is not, what are we self-disclosing? Or the question isn't, are we self-disclosing, but what and how is it useful and how can we use it? And also, what does the patient already know about us that maybe we don't even know that they know?
Yeah, I just thought, and now with social media and the web and all that, patients come in with far more information about us, or have read what we've written, or
That's right.
heard us speak, or there's so much information that's already there.
Yeah.
I also had a patient one time at the end of our treatment say to me, you know, Roy, I know nothing about you and I know everything about you. And
right.
I love that comment because there's something in just being present with another human being that is being disclosed very frequently. Also, I think we use a quote here from Bromberg that he says this: the patient's pressure to force the analyst to give up his right to privacy is organized not simply by a need to know the analyst, but by a wish to know what the analyst knows about the patient, but has dissociated. What do you think of that?
I love that. I think the clients, we use the term a lot, people want access to our minds. And I think, patients aren't just being nosy. They don't want to necessarily know how many kids I have or how long I've been married. They may want to know that, but they want to know, what do I know about them? What is my experience of them? And what is the experiences Bromberg says that sometimes I don't even let myself know about them. So I have to do a lot of soul searching to look at what I have dissociated, what I have not let myself know that I know about the patient. That's what our patients want to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm thinking of a couple of patients who pressured me a lot for personal information about myself. But when I offered, they were always disappointed.
Right. It's
They
kind of
just wanted to
boring.
kind of know, are you with me? Are you awake?
Yes.
And yeah. So we chose in this chapter, Brad, to talk about erotic transference, countertransference enactments as our way to try and communicate the importance of disclosure. And I think the first thing I want to talk about before we disclose why we chose the erotic is you and I are also really not talking so much about personal self-disclosures. We've generally found them to be not that helpful, and that our patients aren't that interested in our personal lives, but they're very, very attuned, as we should be, to what is going on in the in-between. And so we're actually acknowledging relational disclosure of the therapist and the patient, not personal disclosure. That rarely, in my mind, has been all that helpful. In fact, I was thinking about someone I was supervising who did offer a personal disclosure, and it seemed helpful, and the patient felt some relief from it. But what seemed to be more important was exploring what that experience was like to have that disclosure, if you will, to keep it in the realm of the intersubjective relational space. But you and I chose the erotic, and I know in part for me that I will certainly talk about my case on the erotic experience. But why do you think we chose it, and why do you think you did as well?
Well, I always tell my students that I feel like there's two things that I find the most challenging to experience from my patients. First of all, I'll say it that way, and that is their anger and their attraction.
Right.
But what I've come to understand over time is those are the same two things that are most difficult for me to experience towards my patients.
Very
my
nice.
Anger toward them and my attraction towards them.
Yeah.
So I think I've come to recognize over the years that those things that are most challenging are sometimes also the most helpful to look at. Both of them are extremely relational. And as you said, I sometimes differentiate between a self-revelation and a self-disclosure. Self-revelation may be to say, oh yeah, I have this, I live here, I have these kids, or I have this medical issue, or whatever it might be. But again, I agree, that's not usually that helpful. The self-disclosure is my experience of being with the patient, what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling. And again, those two things, I think anger and attraction, eroticism is highly charged, which means there's a lot of meaning there. There's a lot of important stuff to explore.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same for me. It's kind of what we fear the most with our patients. We want it to be a kindly, empathic, nice, positive transference, good object experience.
Yes, be good. Yeah.
And attraction and aggression are evident in every relationship, and certainly have to be evident within our own work. And I think it's what we fear the most that's going to occur. And I think it's common for us when our patients become angry with us or attracted to us to kind of calm it all down, to regulate it, and to almost deny it, frankly. As opposed
dissociate it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we defend against it, and we're reluctant about to get our mind around it, and to form for both of us this, like, what is trying to push forward here? What is trying to be expressed? And as we'll talk more about the case, but I know with my patient who was number 4, I think, on my caseload, who there was a strong erotic experience and enactment between us. And what she was pushing for was connection, even though it was coming out as, if you don't have sex with me, Roy, I'm going to kill myself. It got to that serious of an experience. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And it was only when I was able to re-enter the room and be in the relationship with her that we were able to actually have a reflection about this and where this is coming from.
But you and we have both commented that, early in our training that this whole area was considered taboo. And you don't talk about it. You don't want to do anything to stimulate the patient. So, if you have to deal with it, then interpret it.
Yeah. In fact, let's move to that. We actually take in this chapter a brief history of countertransference disclosure, and we talk about Bolus, Kuhlman, Hahn, and Gabbard, and where they were at earlier in training as well. And let me just say here, Bolus, who actually had a tremendous impact on the relational movement, in 1994 allows for generative erotic transference, but he most commonly at that time referred to it as a blackness of hate. And he goes on to say, he says, the concern in breaking the analytic barrier of neutrality is that, quote, something is now revealed of the analyst's true feelings, I'm quoting here, or true self, from behind the screen of analytic neutrality. And the analyst gains what she wished, namely the desire to control her object, that is the analyst. But you and I asked, is change not made possible when the screen of analytic neutrality is broken? And I think that's what we're talking about here, is that when we are able to acknowledge that there is an erotic presence and to reflect upon it, that the neutrality is essentially broken, and that's what opens up the possibility of transformation and change. Why don't you take on Kuhlman and what we share here about him?
Yeah, Kuhlman sees the erotic transference again as a form of negative transference. So again, you hear that sort of similar theme going. And he contended that the patient and the therapist suffer from being objects of frustrated desire. They're both desiring and both frustrated. So therefore, you better behave yourself. The patient behaves themselves by free associating, and the therapist by maintaining a professional attitude, which is essentially the rule of abstinence. So whatever you do, of course, don't act on that desire, but also don't give away anything about that desire. Don't talk about it. And yet, as we say later in this on this page and in this section, but isn't that what analysts do? We talk about it. We have to make what's untalkable talkable. And again, if you then go back to what we've said about, all of therapy is self-disclosure. Again, there's really we're pressing into this idea that if we're both feeling it, we both know it's going on, why wouldn't we find a way to talk about it? And talking about it is not acting on it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Kahn, who ironically upset his own career through sexual scandal, used the reenactment of sexual arousal as a perverse collusion. He contended that the pervert, which is quite a word, wishes to make known to himself and announce and press into another his innermost nature, as well as to discharge its instinctual tension. Rather than placing the patient in his locked position, you and I ask, what is the, quote, pervert, if you will, pressing for? Because the erotic is filled with aggressive action and provokes vulnerability, rejection, retaliation, and shame, for sure. But it is important to recognize that which is being pushed away is also what is most desired. And again, it comes to this idea of eros and aggression as a movement towards, rather than just a retaliation against.
Right. And then there's Gabbard, and Gabbard, of course, who's written a lot on boundary violations and boundary crossing in therapy. He says, and this is a quote, "Disclosure of sexual feelings by the analyst is fundamentally different from disclosure of other countertransference affects. Acknowledgement of anger, for example, does not imply either inside the consulting room or outside of it in social situations that violence will ensue." But we say that argument baffles us. And if it's true, we wonder why we can't talk about anger without violence, but we can't talk about sex without consummation. It appears as though for Gabbard, acknowledgement of sex means sex between the participants will ensue. And again, we don't find that to be true. We find that to be, highly problematic. And we're deeply concerned, both of us, that if we can't talk about it, if we can't talk about the way even in which the patient is impacting us, as you said, they're looking for something, right? And if we can't acknowledge that they've impacted us, then we leave out a whole area of conversation about part of the patient's life.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So we shared, they represent a long history of psychoanalytic thinking on the neutrality of the therapist. Perhaps their thoughts have changed and evolved over time as well. But they are representative of a long-standing history of extreme caution around the aggressive and the erotic, and of the need, almost I would call it self-protection of the therapist rather than communication with the patient and the therapist. We then move on to where we are trying to say that and emphasize that eros, we see it as a life force that also scares us when it appears, but it's really trying to communicate something very essential. And this is what's true of relational psychoanalysis in general, that the therapeutic relationship has shifted very significantly to communication rather than defensive structures. I mean, the defensive structures are still present in the theory, but these defenses are also communicative opportunities. And Fairbairn says he saw libido as something that sought relation to another, not gratification. And Ulanov says eros is the function of psychic relatedness that urges us to connect, get involved with, poke into, be in the midst of, reach out to, get inside of, value, not to abstract or theorize, but in get in touch with, invest energy, endow libido. Relatedness does not mean relationship. Rather, eros is like a spark that ignites our passion and then confronts us with how we will live this fire in ordinary space and time. Eros brings us to the mysteries of desire to bond and believe in the other and ourselves as a unit, as a union that enhances both of us and even gives something to the world, benefiting others as if our living adds more to the sum of light available to everyone. It was very fun for me just to quote that, actually, Brad, because somehow her language here is so powerful, which to me does take on not eros just in and of itself, but of the therapeutic relationship in general, that it is pushing for passion, for understanding, for more life, for a deeper way of living in the world.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I've always loved the analytic concept, which I feel like sometimes we forget, that a behavior can have more than one meaning and more than one function.
Yeah.
And so while the erotic could be a kind of repetition, it's also, that maybe is protecting a person, maybe trying to avoid re-traumatization. It's also, as you just said, and as Ulanov says, and Davies has some wonderful quotes in this chapter we use later, is also, again, pressing for connectedness, trying to find a different way of being, right? It's sort of Stephen Mitchell's hope and dread. I dread that this is going to be a repetition, but I'm so hopeful that this time might be different. It might be life-giving. And
Right.
so I think to not lose that idea that any behavior, even if it's a defense, it's serving more than one function. And if we can hold that in our minds and find a way to talk about that, we can help our patients see the leading edge of what's happening between us.
Mm-hmm. Brings to mind two patients, and for some reason, I had seen them back to back, which was interesting, because you're saying they're both, whatever it is, they're pushing for something. What did you just say a moment ago?
Pushing for connection or a new experience or something.
Yeah, something like that. Well, on this one day, I had this one patient who had a very strong attraction, an unbearable one, actually, where she turned her chair away from me because it was an unbearable thing. Because sexuality for her had been so traumatized, it was unbearable for her to imagine that she should or could have any kind of feeling. Mm-hmm. And so that was going on in that session. The second session that came in, the woman said, I have zero attraction to you. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. But also true in her life was the sexual and the terror of a triangulated mother, father, daughter relationship where she was pulled into very uncomfortable places where she would have to dissociate her own sexuality. Mm-hmm. And so I think what I was getting at with something you said is that there's pushing for something, but it can look very different.
Right.
And
right.
That's why we do the work we do, trying to attend to what is beyond the conversation that is at hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And if we're frightened by it as clinicians, then we fall back sometimes into our theory. And I think some of the early, I say this humbly because I love all the, I like Bolus is a hero to me, but but we can fall back into some of these early analytic understandings of the erotic and dismiss it. And Davey says here that what we've been saying, if the analyst refuses to participate into these erotic moments, we leave out whole areas of the patient's unconscious experience.
Yeah, exactly. Which takes me, and maybe we can talk about the two cases we discuss in here, where this particular patient taught me many ways how to be a therapist, which was to be present to begin with, mm-hmm. and to not dissociate. Mm-hmm. And how that story went is this woman had been from a very complex family where I think the mother had been married 3 or 4 times and had married my patient's father twice in those shifts and changes in her life. And her father had abused her for many years, ending in a menage a trois with one of his girlfriends. And so my patient was highly sexualized, and she understood that the way to get connected, the way to make intimacy in her life was to be a sexual object. And as our work continued, it was a very enjoyable woman that I enjoyed tremendously. And I'm very aware that I was contributing very much to the seductive powers that were going on between us and the enjoyment that we were having, until things began to really break down because I was not receiving all of the messages that were coming through to me. And as she became more distraught and more desired and needing more and more and more and more of me, a couple of times she had to be hospitalized. And I believe a lot of that had to do with my dissociation from her drive for connectedness and honesty and presence in me, because I became very, very distant. And one day came into the session and said, I swear to God, you're asexual. And fortunately, I'd been reading Harold Searles at the time, he had a patient come in one day and said, you don't like me, so I'm done working with you. And he said, "Oh no, come in. I like you. Please come in, et cetera, et cetera." She says, "No, I'm done with you. I'm gone." And he then reflects on that. He goes, "You know what? She knew me better than I knew myself. She was right, and she made the right decision." And so something in me got awakened through reading that, and then by her comment, "I swear to God, you're asexual." And what I said at that moment is, at this moment in this room with you at this time, you're right. Because I'm terrified that if I don't go to bed with you, you're going to kill yourself. And that was the opening finally for her and I to begin to reflect upon the eroticism and the relationship, really. And I was now present in the room to have a reflective mind with her about this. And our work was able to then succeed, actually, frankly, and to move ahead. And so that again emphasizes how important the words that our patients bring us, or even the actions, might be literal, but they really aren't. In fact, a cool thing, I saw this patient 20 years after our work, and she did bring up, she said, "It must have been so difficult to work with me because I wanted you so badly." And I said, "But you know what? You really didn't want me in that way at all." And she says, "I never thought about that before, but that is true. I wanted you, but I didn't want that." So again, our work of trying to stay present into that which is arousing to us for sure, but also terrifying.
Yeah.
You had a patient too that I know that is also in this book.
Yeah. I think my patient is a little bit on the other end of the continuum, where primarily her experience around sexuality was deep denial, repression, you might use that term, and dissociation, growing up in a highly restrictive religious family. She was a very attractive, vivacious, intelligent young woman, but saw none of that in herself, didn't experience it in herself. And I think really, in a unique way, she communicated to the world around her, especially men, that there was nothing to see here. And yet there was lots to see there. And I felt it immediately when I began to work with her. And what I began to experience or recognize or believe was that she needed to see me seeing her as an attractive, vivacious woman. And for a long time, that stayed in the realm of just her feeling comfortable with me. She began to flirt a little bit with me. It was almost like in a certain kind of way, I would describe it as a developmental coming of age in the work with me. She was in her 20s, but she was kind of doing some of the work that I think she could have done with a healthy father who could see her and acknowledge her and admire her without that becoming, crossing again boundaries in a way that would be violating. And so she began to have, sexual dreams about us, and she would imagine herself being in my bedroom and going through my closet and all these kinds of lovely sort of metaphors, right, of intimacy and connectedness. And she would begin to wonder about, well, if we met at a bar, would I like her? And, and we would explore all that. And finally, one day in therapy, she said something to the extent of, you probably get, she said something like, you must feel overwhelmed, or you must get tired of all this talk about me, being attracted to you. And again, sort of in this spirit of flying blind, which we talk about in the session, self-disclosure, not always being able to know exactly what we want to say when we should say it, I just sort of blurted out, you don't think I find it enjoyable to have an attractive woman be attracted to me? And it was a form of a question, but it was a disclosure, right? It's clearly a disclosure. And she just sort of paused and said, "Thank you for saying that." And I think it was a moment where, in a way that, opposite of all the fears that the earlier theorists have described, I didn't overwhelm her. I didn't overstimulate her. But essentially what I was saying is, I do see you as an attractive woman, and I do enjoy that. I enjoy that. I enjoy that you're attracted to me. I enjoy that this safe play and conversation that we're engaged in that's okay. It's all right. And it was allowing her, right, to bring things online that developmentally she had never been able to bring online. And that really continued to help her in her own life as she began to date and engage with men outside the session and make wise choices. You know, she made some bad choices along the way, right, as we all do. But she was able to find herself and find her femininity, her womanliness, her power in that, and not be afraid of her sexuality, and use that. And it was really gratifying for me to be a part of that.
Right. And what seems important there is that she always never knew that she could have an impact on a man, that she was a woman that was could penetrate, essentially.
Yeah.
And your experience of her, offering her now to reflect upon, oh, I am a woman. I am attractive. I can get through to that which I thought not available to me.
Right.
You know, it's interesting. I just got my psychoanalytic dialogues journal today, and so I was reading Julie Gerhardt, an article about anecdotes working from her home, but it really is an article with responses around race and privilege and white innocence and all that sort of thing. Right. And based on what we're talking about today, and what you just brought with your patient, is that your patient needed more than just your curiosity and concern or her historical interpretation of why she is the way she does. And I want to bring this to our attention here, where she says, she's quoting Gonzalez here, I believe, rigidly maintaining its classical stance, psychoanalysis could on the one hand attach itself to an embalmed and stiffened corpse, safeguarding its acquisitions without ever calling into question the theory sustaining them. She goes on to say, in other words, sometimes a stance of curiosity and concern is too constricted, too lifeless, and may not reach the patient. What is sometimes needed is some form of throwing away the book that Hoffman talks about, something more engaged and more vitalizing. And I think in both of our cases, what was happening is the movement happened when we became more engaged, and the work was then able to be vitalized.
Yeah, and that's what we mean by courageous speech, right? It takes courage. It's fear and trembling, but we enter into it in that desire to be real and authentic with our patients.
Yes. And I think I also want to underline with that right now, with the courageous speech, is I think both of you and I are trying to move away from self-disclosure as a personal self-disclosure. Right. And that what we're talking about here is speaking into what is occurring intersubjectively in the relational space between the patient and the therapist.
That's right.
And I want to kind of continue to emphasize that.
Right.
We say on page 189, and why don't you go ahead and say what we say on page 189 about, which pretty much offers our position.
Yeah, we say from our experience as we demonstrated, or we just demonstrated in these vignettes, that interacting defensively with our patients diminishes our capacity to understand what is unfolding, circumscribes the complexity of the delicate interplay, and ultimately damages the relationship. We posit a reconsideration of the transference-countertransference relationship, that affective states, such as sex and aggression, must be considered from a variety of vantage points. The patient's perspective, the perspective of the therapist, that which has been dissociated, and the interaction of the two.
Yeah. I like that. One of the things, Brad, if you recall, when we first did this chapter as an article, there was a couple of things as we continued to develop it as a chapter that came to our mind. One is that we needed to emphasize around courageous speech the whole concept of disciplined spontaneity, and that is the art of metabolization. And so I want us to talk about that.
Yeah.
The other was that ended up in another chapter in the book that we won't necessarily talk about today, that there is a relational ethic. And so we write a chapter on ethics and the integrity of holding the relationship sacred, frankly.
Yes, yes.
And that one of the ways that is essential to courageous speech is this art of metabolization that also includes humility and uncertainty. McWilliams says, I have some certainty about process, but uncertainty about content.
Yeah.
And so everything we bring is to be invited to be played with rather than as a truth, which has a historical idea around interpretation, although I know that's interesting. But those are the two major things. And this whole idea of metabolization, even though the patient has the right to our minds and our affect, it's a very disciplined process that we go through as we bring our minds and our affects to our patients. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, I as I try to teach this to graduate students, and you're teaching these days people postgraduate, my students get quite anxious when I start talking about disclosure, but that's why metabolism is so important. And I say, to self-disclose is not to say everything that comes to mind. It's to sit in a kind of reverie. I love Ogden's idea of reverie, and letting everything come to your mind, right? It's a kind of co-free association. I think, why is this coming to my mind now? Why am I wanting to say this? What will happen if I say it? To me, the way that we sort of assess the power of a self-disclosure is, what's the outcome of it? What happens afterwards, right? I always say the most important moment in therapy is right after we, the therapist, say something.
Yeah.
Does it awaken the patient? Does it deepen the affect? Do the associations come more? Does the conversation increase, or does it shut them down in some way? Does it frighten them? Does it frighten the two of us?
Does it engage us into co-metabolization?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Does the client's mind get working more?
Yeah.
And so this isn't about being reckless or careless in our disclosures. In fact, we say sometimes that when you feel like you want to say something, maybe that's the time not to say it.
Right.
And if you don't want to say it, maybe that's when you need to do more metabolism and figure out, well, there may be something here that I really need to say, that somehow this is an enactment of dissociation. I don't want to say it, but I really need to say it. Yeah. So there's a carefulness about it, but I think that's where we have to trust the process and trust our own minds and let things, simmer, percolate a little bit. To me, that's metabolism.
Yeah. I think it is helpful, I think, and we say this in the book, that interaction includes inaction.
Yes, yes.
That in-between place to ponder, to catch one's breath, to organize and metabolize. In fact, spontaneity without discipline may too quickly, as Corbett says, solve the limits of knowing, or more precisely, foreclose the necessity of unknowing, which is vital to analytic exchange.
Right.
Yeah.
And can I just say, I had a colleague call me one time after reading this chapter, and he called me and he said, I think I said too much too soon.
I love that. Yeah.
And so he was a good clinician. So he was familiar with rupture and repair, and he could go back and talk with the client about how his self-disclosure had been too soon. She wasn't ready for it. And they were able to work through it. But he had felt something, and rather than metabolizing, there's a lovely quote by Cornett here, I think it is, or Corbett, which is about waiting and associating and wandering into reverie and wandering back out and, debating and practicing in our minds. If I said this, what might happen? What might, and we can't know for sure, there's some flying blind here, as Rennick says, but we can imagine some scenarios, right, in our own minds before we throw things out there. And my colleague had sort of thrown it out there, and I don't think spent quite enough time maybe in reverie about it or metabolizing about it.
And what I want to say about that too is you made one little line in there that the patient wasn't ready. I would say that the therapist wasn't ready.
Yeah, they weren't ready.
And I want to make that clear, that so often we say, I'm not going to say it because the patient isn't ready. And I'm going, how the hell do I know if the patient is ready if I don't say it, right?
Yeah.
But again, it's so nuanced as to how we say it. And what I'm discovering is that if I am saying it with a spirit of, I don't know, but here's what's on my thoughts and my mind and what's getting stirred in me. The patient feels very drawn into that.
Yes.
And if it feels like it's tripped up, the patient I found will let me know. And also it helps me and them formulate more closely to what it might be and what might be going on.
Yeah.
And so again, I would say that if we are offering ourselves from how the patient is infecting us and impacting us as best we can. Like sometimes I'm saying, I'm having this thought and it makes no sense to me, but I want to give you the thought so you can help it make sense to me and to us. It engages the conversation. And so often I think people come to see us because they have this whole interior life that they want to have a conversation with and know how someone is experiencing it. But socially, that doesn't happen. But clinically, that's the hope and the goal.
Right. You know, it reminds me of a wonderful quote from Mel Slavin, who was talking about a patient who said to him once, I never realized that how much to understand my own mind, I would have to understand your mind. Or we would have to understand your mind. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Brad, I always love working with you. And that our time is coming to an end. What kind of as you just reflect upon what we've talked about today, what is there anything in particular you want to leave our listeners with as we come to a close?
Yeah, I think it's so important to have a space as a clinician, whether it's in your own therapy or with a colleague like you and I have done, where we can have these conversations about what's happening inside of us as clinicians and know that that's okay. And that is in fact the work. If you don't have that, then I don't think you're able to bring that into your work with patients. Right. And so I'm always telling students and colleagues, you know, find those spaces where you can have these conversations of metabolism, where you can say, you know, I feel attracted to this patient, or, you know, I'm wanting to find a way to utilize my feelings, my experience in the room with my patient. If you can find spaces where you can do that, supervision, your own therapy, a colleague, then I think you're going to find ways that you can bring it into your work, and it just brings your work to a new level. Yeah.
I think the other thing that I would want to leave with the listeners as well is one of the things I teach endlessly is we feel before we think. And in psychology in general, and psychoanalysis in particular, I think we pretty quickly deny the feeling and go into our minds. And to really let yourself be radically open to the deep affective states that are getting stirred in you in relationship to this patient. And then begin to think, what the hell is this all about? I didn't have this feeling till I was with this patient. This has something to do with the patient. This has something to do with the patient and I. Now, how can I imagine myself bringing that to them? I think that's a really important aspect of being courageous to speak while practicing at some level a disciplined spontaneity.
Yeah. I love that for sure.
Well, good friend, I always love working with you. And
yes, you as well.
And we'll talk again, I'm sure.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks for having me.